Good morning, and thanks so much for joining us on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wolforst. In just a few short weeks since the militant group Hamas attacked Israel, raining rockets down, infiltrating by air, sea, and land, and taking hundreds of hostages, Israel has declared war on the terrorist organization. Millions displaced and thousands killed in Gaza. America pledging support for Israel's defense. U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal is here with us now. He just got back from his own trip to the Middle East with several other lawmakers. Senator Blumenthal, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So obviously there's not much safety or sense of security in Gaza or Israel right now. First, tell me a little bit about what you saw and heard there.
I was part of a delegation, 10 leading members of the United States Senate, evenly divided between both parties. And I will tell you, I've rarely, if ever, seen so much emotion on the part of any of my colleagues in the group, so unified, speaking with a single voice in solidarity with Israel. And the purpose of our trip, in large part, was to say to Israel at this time of raw grief and fear that America stands with Israel today, tomorrow, and forever. But we also were there to grieve with Israelis and Palestinians who have suffered losses, to urge more humanitarian aid for the people of Gaza who are suffering from hunger and other needs for medicine, fuel, water, food, and to push negotiations for release of the hostages, more than 200 of them, from all over the world, as well as Israel, including many Americans. And we pushed not only in Israel, but also in Saudi Arabia for continued talks to normalize relations between Israel and other countries like Saudi Arabia in the region, and in Egypt to open the gate and enable more expedited and expanded humanitarian relief. And of course, we come back determined to give Israel whatever it needs to win this war against a terrorist organization that has as its single-minded, sole purpose to destroy the state of Israel and eradicate the Jewish people. And that determination on Hamas's part is reflected in the abhorrent atrocity, murder, rape, torture, videos that we saw that I can't even begin to describe beyond words in their cruelty and barbarism. And so we were deeply moved when we talked to the families of hostages as well as others there about their courage and strength.
And let's talk about those hostages. We know, as you said, this is obviously a horrible reality for some Americans, Israelis, and of course the international community as a whole. For those of us who aren't tuned in to the inner workings of the White House or Capitol Hill right now, when President Biden says he's working to get the hostages released, what does that process actually look like?
The process is intricate, complicated, and challenging because it involves other countries in the region, like Qatar, that may have ties to Hamas, personal relationships with the Hamas leaders. And we want to make sure that every possible avenue of talks is explored. And my hope is that there will be progress. But also, President Biden has indicated very clearly, and I hope he will do so again and again and again, that we need to deter not only Hamas from any untoward action about those hostages, but also Hezbollah, another Iran proxy, from opening a front in the north that could put in peril not only the hostages, but others in Israel. A front in the north could lead to a wider conflagration, and one of our objectives was to contain and limit the war as it goes forward. And we're sending a very strong signal to Iran. Don't open another front through your proxy, Hezbollah, as you did by giving the green light to Hamas.
Right. And I want to talk about, the possibility of this expanding in a little bit. But first, thousands of miles away, we know the impacts of this conflict even before Hamas's attack are felt here at home. But there's also an online war happening right now. In one way, people are able to see and hear what's happening on the ground. On the other hand, we've seen disinformation running rampant. There's censorship. There's conflicting information. It's obviously rapidly changing. How do you think people can begin to handle this sort of newer face of war?
Very difficult challenge, and it's a great question because not only is there disinformation and misinformation through social media, for example, but also even in reputable and legitimate sources of news, there is this fog of war because there are very few reliable sources of information in Gaza itself. And so, for example, the bombing of the hospital in Gaza enabled Hamas to release information, get it out into the bloodstream of the social media sources that indicated Israel was the source. Now there's a high degree of confidence on the part of our intelligence community that that rocket came from within Gaza itself, from possibly one of the jihadist groups. But the challenges of reliable information, very, very steep and difficult. And the best advice I can give is simply go to reputable news sources.
Right. And as people try to process and mourn and educate themselves about this very complex conflict and region, Biden and the White House have been kind of consistently saying Hamas does not represent the people of Palestine. How do we make that distinction clear as this war continues on?
A very important question. This war is against Hamas, not against the Palestinian people. And that's why we have advocated consistently and constantly for more humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people. And thinking ahead to the day after, Israel needs to win the peace as well as winning the war. And that involves, in my view, a state for the Palestinian people, a two-state solution, which is still viable and should be one of the objectives of normalizing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. In the meantime, there's a pause to enable more negotiations on hostages as well as more humanitarian aid for the people of Gaza, the Palestinians, and an effort to minimize civilian casualties.
And when it comes to U.S. security and intelligence in this region, I mean, is this something that, the U.S., obviously hindsight is 2020, should have been following more closely? Or from your perspective, what can you tell us about what American intelligence and interest has looked like in this region up until now?
There seems to be a general consensus that the attack, murderous, brutal, inhuman, was also preceded by a massive intelligence failure on the part of the Israelis. And they have acknowledged that failure. But going forward, there has to be more adroit and astute judgment about what the threats are, not only to Israel, but also the United States. I should emphasize that Israel's situation is a matter of our national security. Israel is an essential ally in a very dangerous neighborhood. Its military relationship with the United States is very close, as is their intelligence community close to ours. So we have a national interest here, and that's one of the reasons why I have been championing more aid to Israel as part of a bigger package that the president has submitted. More than $10 billion. Israel needs more interceptors for the Iron Dome, more precision-guided missiles for its aircraft, more ammunition for its artillery. I will be advocating that kind of military assistance, but also humanitarian assistance. Very, very important. So the United States has a vital role to play, not only in intelligence gathering, but also in military aid. And it is in our national security interests.
And I do want to talk about that aid. And obviously, before you mentioned concerns about this war growing and expanding, you and your colleagues have been monitoring Iran. Protesters in Baghdad have posted solidarity with Hamas. What are the main concerns here with the international community and the U.S. as this war continues?
The United States needs to be a partner with Israel in fighting the disinformation and misinformation that may be misleading the world community about what Israel is seeking to do. One of the reasons for this pause in the ground offensive is to enable more humanitarian aid, as well as possible release of more hostages, and to minimize civilian casualties. So we push very hard on these issues, such as humanitarian aid and minimization of civilian casualties. I think the Israeli military will be doing its best. They want to reduce casualties on their own side as well as among innocent civilians. And the effort has to go forward to convince the world community that Hamas is a terrorist organization bent on destroying Israel and eradicating the Jewish people, but it is also a threat to the peace and stability of the entire region. It is a proxy of Iran, which wants to destabilize the region. And the leaders of the region, not just in Israel, but in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, where we visited, understand the threat that Iran poses, and they have opposed that threat.
Well, and as you mentioned, President Biden as well also warning about attacks specifically on civilians and kind of saying, it's pouring gasoline on the fire there. He's warned Israel not to get too consumed in rage as this continues. Are there or should there be discussions of provisions here?
The Israelis are talking to our military. We've sent an expert on urban warfare, street-to-street combat. We've engaged in it in Afghanistan and Iraq at Mosul and Fallujah. General Glynn, which he is there now advising the military not only on how to combat warfare by Hamas in the tunnels and the underground city that they established, as well as street-to-street, house-to-house warfare, which is perilous to civilians as well as the Israeli soldiers. But the minimization of death or casualties to civilians is very much on the minds of Americans.
Right.
And there's no question that our experience indicates that this kind of urban warfare is potentially brutal and difficult, and that has to be on the minds of the Israelis as they prepare for this ground offensive.
Right. And as we're speaking about the attack from Hamas, the tragedies and the atrocities happening in Gaza, right now it's reminiscent of when you came on the show earlier this year in February. You were telling us about your trip to Ukraine. Obviously, we finally have a Speaker of the House this week. The House is no longer frozen here. We've seen the call from President Biden and, from you and some of your other colleagues to approve more and continued aid for Ukraine, as well as new money for Israel. Can those aid packages really get done at the same time here?
Not only can they get done, they should get done as part of a single package. Both Ukraine and Israel involve our national security. If Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, he will keep going against our NATO allies. Right now, we have no troops on the ground. Zelensky doesn't want them, but if Putin goes against Poland, Romania, Finland, Sweden, Moldova, we will have an obligation under Article 5 of the NATO agreement, the treaty, to put our troops on the ground and put them in harm's way. And my view is we should provide Ukraine with the tools it needs to win against Putin's brutal, murderous invasion. And our national security is involved there. We should couple that aid with aid to Israel. My hope is we'll have bipartisan support. We do in the Senate, very strong bipartisan support for both Ukraine and Israel. I hope we will in the House as well, This new speaker is an unknown.
This aid, as you're saying, is so important. Congress is pushing for it. President Biden is pushing for it. And you're saying there has been bipartisan support. The House has a speaker now, but, we have seen interest sort of waning, especially from some House Republicans. So when it comes to people, our residents, especially here in Connecticut, why should they care? They're thousands of miles away from Ukraine, from Israel, from Gaza. When you're talking to a constituent, beyond just our NATO agreements or international relationships, on a more personal level, why do they have a stake in these wars? What are the values at war here?
Really important for Americans to understand how our national security interest, our national defense is involved in both Ukraine and Israel. In Ukraine, Putin must be stopped there, or he will keep going against NATO allies, Finland, Sweden, Romania, Moldova, and we have an obligation to them to come to their aid if they're attacked with our own troops. Right now, we have no troops on the ground, no casualties or death to our men and women in uniform. But we know that Putin won't stop with Ukraine if he's allowed to win there. And so our national security interest is served by our aiding Ukraine, giving them the tools they need to win. And likewise in Israel, fighting a terrorist organization like Hamas to survive. Literally, it's a matter of survival for Israel and for the Jewish people against a terrorist group that has murdered, raped, tortured people there and will destabilize the region through Iran and other Iran proxies if they are not stopped. So the American people and our friends and neighbors in Connecticut should understand how our national security interest is well served by this combined package of aid to both Ukraine and Israel, and it's well worth the investment. Look at it as an investment. We have put into Ukraine less than 5% of our total defense budget for 1 year, which is about $900 billion in total. No American casualties and no deaths to American men and women in uniform. And yet we've degraded Russia's armored forces and troops by about a half. They're half the strength they were. So we are getting our money's worth, and this investment should continue as a matter of our own national interest.
Well, Senator Blumenthal, as always, thank you so much for speaking with us about this. We'll definitely continue to be covering this conflict, but we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much.
And we'll be covering this on Fox 61 as well, getting you context and the latest here on The Real Story and all morning and night on the Fox 61 News and our app and our website. And if you're trying to educate yourself and wrap your head around the decades of conflict in Israel and Gaza, you can head to our Real Story tab on the Fox 61 website, where we've broken down a lot of it for you with an expert. But stay with us. There's still more to come here on The Real Story.